There was a night when the rain fell so hard it sounded like the sky itself was weeping, and in the middle of that storm, a woman found a baby crying alone in the mud, wrapped in a torn cloth with no mother in sight. She had no idea that the child in her arms would grow up to shake an entire village to its knees, and that the truth of where he came from would take almost 20 years to surface. This is her story. Before we continue, if you love stories like this, stories about hidden truths, quiet strength, and the kind of love that outlasts every secret, take a moment to hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We tell a new one every week, and trust me, you don't want to miss what happens by the end of this one. In the village of Nneka there lived a woman named Nneka. She was not old, but she was not young either. She was the kind of woman the village had learned to speak of in soft voices, the way people speak about someone they pity but do not fully understand. Nneka had been married once many years before to a hardworking man who farmed yams and kept bees on the edge of the forest. Their marriage was short. Fever took him before they could have children and left Nneka standing alone in a compound built for two. For years after his death, Nneka lived quietly. She woke before the sun, went to her farm, sold what she grew at the market, and returned home before dark. She did not remarry, though many men in the village had asked. She said her heart had buried itself with her husband, and no man since had been able to dig it back up. The women of Nneka whispered about her sometimes, calling her the widow who talked to her yams like they were children, the widow who cried at weddings that were not her own. But even those who mocked her could not deny that Nneka had a kindness in her that most people lacked. If a child was hungry, she fed them. If an old man could not carry his firewood, she carried it for him. She gave more than she had, and somehow she always found more to give. By the time she was in her late 30s, most people had stopped waiting for her life to change. They assumed she would grow old alone, tend her farm until her back could no longer bend, and be buried beside her husband when her time came. Nobody in Nneka could have imagined that her story was about to take a turn that would be spoken about for generations. It happened on a night in the rainy season when the wind screamed through the trees and the river behind the village swelled past its banks. Nneka had gone to check on her yam barn before the storm grew worse, wrapping herself in an old shawl and carrying a small lamp that struggled to stay lit against the wind. As she made her way back toward her hut, she heard something strange beneath the roar of the rain. A cry, thin, weak, almost swallowed by the storm, but unmistakably human. She stood still, telling herself it was probably an animal, or the wind playing tricks on her ears the way it sometimes did on nights like this. But the cry came again, closer this time, coming from near the bushes at the edge of the path that led toward the river. Her heart began to pound. She lifted her lamp higher and stepped carefully through the mud, following the sound until she saw it. A bundle, wrapped in cloth soaked through by the rain, lying at the base of a tree where the ground was slightly raised, away from the flooding path. Inside that bundle was a baby no more than a few weeks old, his small body shivering, his cries growing weaker with every passing second. Nneka did not think. She did not stop to wonder who the child belonged to, or why he had been left there in the middle of a storm. She scooped him into her arms, pulled her shawl tighter around them both, and ran back to her hut as fast as her legs could carry her. That night, by the light of her lamp, she dried the baby, fed him warm water mixed with a little honey, and held him against her chest until his shivering stopped and his cries turned into soft, exhausted breathing. She noticed something as she cleaned him. Tied around his tiny wrist was a thin cord, and on that cord hung a small carved pendant, dark wood shaped like a bird with its wings spread wide. It was old, the carving worn smooth by years of handling, the kind of object that is passed down, not made new. Nneka studied it for a long time that night, turning it over in her fingers, wondering what kind of story it carried. But the baby needed her more than her questions did, and so she set the pendant aside and focused on keeping him alive until morning. When the sun rose and the village began to stir, word spread quickly that the widow Nneka had found an abandoned baby by the river. People came to her compound throughout the day, some out of concern, most out of curiosity. They asked her the same questions over and over. Whose baby is this? Who would leave a child to die in a storm? Are you sure it is safe to keep him? Nneka answered as best she could, which was not much because she did not know the answers herself. The village elder at the time, a stern man named Okonkwo no, we will call him Baba Uch. To avoid confusion, Baba Uch came to her compound that same week and told her plainly that taking in an abandoned child, one whose parentage no one could confirm, was a dangerous thing. In their tradition, he said, children left in such a manner were sometimes believed to carry misfortune or worse, to be the result of shameful circumstances that could bring trouble to whoever raised them. He advised her to hand the child over to a family in a neighboring town, one that took in children with no history, so that Umudike would not have to carry whatever burden came with him. Nneka listened respectfully as she always did, but when Baba Uch finished speaking, she looked down at the baby sleeping in her arms and said something that many in the village would remember for years afterward. She said that a child does not choose how he enters the world, and it is not for us to punish him for the circumstances of his arrival. She said she had prayed for a child for many years, and if this storm had brought one to her doorstep, she would not be the one to turn him away. And so, despite the whispers, despite the warnings, despite the suspicious glances from women who crossed the road rather than pass too close to her compound, Nneka kept the baby. She named him Obiora, a name that means the people's child, because in her heart she believed he belonged to more than just herself. She believed the whole village had a part to play in raising him, whether they wanted to or not. The early years were not easy. Nneka's farm alone could not comfortably feed two mouths, and the money she made at the market barely stretched to cover cloth for the baby and the herbs he sometimes needed when he fell ill. She took on extra work, weaving baskets late into the night after Obiora had fallen asleep, selling them alongside her vegetables. She skipped meals more often than she let anyone know, telling neighbors she had already eaten when the truth was she had given her portion to Obiora instead. The gossip did not die down quickly. Some of the village women avoided buying from her stall, muttering that misfortune followed children of unknown blood. A few children were told by their mothers not to play with Obiora, though this rule was broken constantly, because children rarely care about the things adults worry over. Obiora grew up with more affection from the village children than from their parents, which suited him fine because he did not yet understand what the whispers meant. There was one person, however, who never seemed to fully accept Nneka's decision. A woman named Chinir, who had once hoped to marry Nneka's late husband before he chose Nneka instead, had never quite let go of her old resentment. Chinir often spoke against Nneka in the market, questioning her judgment, hinting that a woman who could not have her own children was foolish to raise someone else's. Nneka never responded to these comments directly. She simply continued raising her son, letting her actions speak louder than any argument could. Every so often in those early years, a stranger would pass through Umudike. A tall woman, wrapped in cloth the color of dried blood, who never stayed long and never spoke much to anyone except to ask quiet questions about the widow and the baby she had taken in. She would sit at the edge of the market, watching Nneka's stall from a distance, then disappear before anyone could approach her. Nneka noticed her more than once, but each time she tried to get closer, the woman was already gone, swallowed by the paths leading out of the village. Nneka told herself it was nothing, perhaps a traveler curious about local gossip, and pushed the thought aside. She had a child to raise and no time to chase shadows. As Obiora grew older, it became clear that he was no ordinary child. By the time he was 7, he could carve small animals out of wood with a skill that made grown carvers pause and stare. By 10, he had a way with words that made elders forget he was still a boy, listening to him settle small arguments between his friends with a wisdom that seemed far beyond his years. Nneka watched him grow with a pride that filled every corner of her small hut, and slowly, very slowly, the village's suspicion began to soften into something closer to acceptance. But not everyone softened. Chinir's resentment, if anything, grew sharper as Obiora's talents became harder to ignore. She began telling anyone who would listen that a child so gifted, appearing out of nowhere on a stormy night, was proof that something unnatural was at play. She reminded people of old stories, warnings passed down through generations about children born of spirits or left behind by those running from something far away. Most people laughed off her words. But a few, especially the older and more superstitious among them, began to look at Obiora a little differently. One incident when Obiora was around 12 deepened the mystery surrounding him. A trader passing through Umudik on his way to a distant kingdom stopped at the market and happened to see the wooden bird pendant that Obiora still wore around his neck, the same one he had been found with as a baby. The trader's face changed the moment he saw it. He asked Obiora almost too eagerly where he had gotten such a pendant, saying he had seen its exact match only once before, worn by a family far to the east, a family connected to a royal house that had fallen into conflict years earlier. Nneka, standing nearby, felt her stomach tighten at those words, but before she could ask the trader to explain further, he seemed to catch himself, muttered something about being mistaken, and hurried away before anyone could press him. That night, Nneka lay awake staring at the pendant in her hands after Obiora had fallen asleep, turning the trader's words over and over in her mind. She decided, for the sake of peace, not to mention it to anyone, not even to Obiora, at least not until he was old enough to understand whatever truth might come with it. Years passed. Obiora grew into a young man respected throughout Umudik, not for the mystery of his birth, but for the character he had built with his own two hands. He farmed alongside Nneka, took over much of the heavy work as her strength began to fade, and became known throughout the region for his woodcarving, pieces so detailed that traders came from far villages just to buy from him. He never forgot the woman who had raised him. He often told people without embarrassment that whatever he had become, it was because a widow had chosen to love a stranger's child as her own. Then, in the year Obiora turned 19, everything changed. A season of hardship fell upon Umudik. The rains refused to come when they were expected, and the little that did fall was not enough to save the crops. Sickness spread through several neighboring villages, and travelers began arriving in greater numbers, fleeing troubles from kingdoms further east where, it was said, a war over succession had torn apart a ruling family and scattered its people across the land. It was during this season of chaos that the woman in the dried blood-colored cloth returned to Umudik, older now, her hair streaked with gray, but unmistakably the same figure who used to watch Nneka's stall from a distance years before. This time she did not stay at the edge of the market. She walked directly to Nneka's compound and asked, in a voice trembling with something between fear and hope, to see the boy she had once seen as a baby. Nneka, now much older herself, stood at her doorway and studied the woman carefully before allowing her inside. Obiora, hearing the commotion, came in from the farm still carrying his tools, and the moment the woman saw him, she began to weep. She introduced herself as Obiora. No, we will call her Nneka, a name not on our restricted list. Nneka explained through broken sobs that she had once served as a nursemaid in a royal household far to the east, a household that had fallen into a violent struggle for power 19 years earlier. The ruling family had been attacked in the night by rivals seeking the throne. And in the chaos, Nneka had been given a single task by the dying wife of the ruler: save the newborn child no matter the cost and make sure he never fell into the hands of those who wanted him dead. Nneka had fled with the baby for days, moving through forests and rivers, always one step ahead of the men sent to finish what the attack had started. When she reached the storm that night near Umudik, exhausted, injured, and certain that the men chasing her were close behind, she made the hardest decision of her life. She left the baby where she believed he would be found quickly, in a place slightly protected from the flooding. Hoping that whoever discovered him would have a kind enough heart to take him in, and prayed that by disappearing herself she would draw the pursuers away from the child's trail. It had worked. The men chasing her had followed her instead of searching for the baby, and Nneka had spent years afterward moving from place to place, never able to return directly to Umudik for fear that she would lead danger straight to the child she had tried so hard to save. She had watched from a distance whenever she could, checking on him in secret, waiting for the day it would be safe to tell the truth. That day, she said, had finally come. The war in the East was over. The rival family that had seized power had been overthrown by their own people after years of cruelty, and the surviving members of the original royal bloodline were being sought out and called home. Obiora, the woman explained, her hands shaking as she spoke, was the last living son of that bloodline. The wooden bird pendant around his neck was the mark of his family, a symbol carried only by those born into it. The room fell into a heavy silence. Obiora looked down at the pendant he had worn his entire life without truly understanding its weight, and then looked at Nneka, the only mother he had ever known, searching her face for some kind of answer to a question he did not know how to ask. Nneka's eyes were full of tears, but she did not look away from him. She took his hands in hers, the same hands that had carved 100 small animals out of wood since he was a boy, and told him that whatever blood ran through his veins, whatever crown waited for him somewhere far away, none of it changed the truth of who he was to her. He was her son. He had always been her son, and nothing that happened next would ever take that away. The following weeks were filled with difficult conversations. Messengers arrived from the east, confirming everything Nneka had said, bringing with them elders who recognized the pendant immediately and wept at the sight of the young man wearing it, seeing in his face the echo of a family they had mourned for nearly 2 decades. They spoke of a kingdom waiting for its rightful heir, of a throne left empty out of respect for the possibility that the youngest son had survived. They asked Obiora to return with them to reclaim what had been stolen from him the night his birth family was destroyed. Obiora struggled with the decision more than anyone expected. He had grown up as a farmer and a carver, not as a prince. He had learned patience from the soil, not from a court. But more than anything, he struggled with the thought of leaving Nneka, of leaving the woman who had given up meals so he could eat, who had defended him against a village full of whispers, who had never once treated him as anything less than her own flesh and blood. In the end, it was Nneka herself who convinced him to go. She told him that the boy she had found in the mud that stormy night had been given a second chance at life, and now he was being given a chance to give life back to a kingdom that had been waiting for him. She told him that love was never about holding on tightly. It was about giving people the strength to become who they were always meant to be, even if it meant letting them walk a path away from you. Obiora left Nneka with tears in his eyes, but he did not leave alone. He insisted, against the protests of the Eastern elders, that Nneka travel with him not as a servant, not as a distant guest, but as his mother, honored in whatever kingdom he was to lead. The elders, moved by his loyalty, agreed without further argument. Before they left, the entire village gathered to say their goodbyes, and it was then that the truth of Nneka's years of quiet sacrifice finally settled over everyone who had once doubted her. Chinir, the woman who had spent years speaking against Nneka, stood among the crowd with tears on her face, ashamed of every word she had once spoken. Baba Uch, now much older and slower in his steps, approached Nneka and admitted in front of everyone that he had been wrong to ever suggest she give the child away. He said that Nneka would remember her not as the widow who talked to her yams, but as the woman whose love had raised a king. Obiora went on to reclaim his family's place, ruling not with the harshness that had once torn his birth family apart, but with the patience and humility of a man who had spent his childhood carving wood and tending yams beside a widow who asked for nothing in return except his happiness. Nneka lived the rest of her days surrounded by comfort she never once sought, but what she treasured most was not the wealth or the title she was given. It was the sight of her son, now a grown man with responsibilities she could barely imagine, still finding time every single day to sit beside her, exactly as he had done as a boy, simply to talk, simply to be near her. The story of the widow who found a king in a storm spread far beyond Nneka, told in villages up and down the region for years afterward. But those who knew Nneka best always said the real story was never about crowns or bloodlines. It was about a woman who chose to love a stranger's child without conditions, without knowing what it would cost her or what it would one day give back to her. It was about the truth that family is not only what we are born into, but what we choose to build with our own two hands, even in the middle of a storm. If this story moved you, let us know in the comments which part touched you the most, and don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more folktales just like it. There are many more stories waiting to be told, so stay close because you won't want to miss the next one.